Righty ho. So as I say, chapter 21, that one's done. Just as a recap then of the chapter 21 material, which was the GDP, and just measuring GDP. We went through an example of measuring GDP and changing real GDP to nominal GDP or nominal GDP to real GDP. So part of the discussion was what is the relationship between real and nominal GDP. The key distinguishing factor obviously between nominal and real GDP is that the value of real GDP is calculated by taking the value of nominal GDP and adjusting it for the effects of inflation. In other words, adjusting it for any of the changes in the price level. We started on Thursday talking about chapter 22. Chapter 22, towards the second half of that chapter, talks about inflation and measuring inflation and something called the price index, the consumer price index. We have not yet spoken about the consumer price index, but the CPI or in any of those indexes, whether it's the CPI, consumer price index, or whether it's the GDP deflator, which is also another type of price index, either of those two indexes we can use for adjusting the value of nominal GDP to get to real GDP. So when we were doing this example, that was the principle I was trying to illustrate. I've now written it up, I think, a lot more clearly than what we did last week. So I'm going to just run through what that discussion was about. If you've got any questions, just stop me. This will be our recap of chapter 21, and then after this we're going to jump into chapter 22. So, say we have nominal GDP for the year 2005. We calculate our nominal GDP as quantity times the price level in 2005. We said imagine the quantity of goods sold was 10 and the aggregate price level was 100. Then our nominal GDP would be a value of 10 times 100, which is 1,000. We are also told, point number 2 here, that the GDP in 2005, we are going to use that value as our base year. If our base year is 2005, then we know that real GDP in 2005 is equal to nominal GDP in 2005. That's what the base year means. The base year means we set nominal GDP equal to real GDP. So if our nominal GDP in 2005 is 1,000, the value of real GDP in 2005 is also 1,000. Everyone with me? Okay? Say we then got asked the question, or we want to know for some reason, what is real GDP in 2010? Okay? And we are given nominal GDP in 2010. And we know that nominal GDP in 2010 is the quantity of goods sold in 2010 times the aggregate price level in 2010, which we just said was 118. Therefore, our nominal GDP in 2010 is going to be 1,180. If we wanted to work out real GDP, what that means is, what is the price of GDP sold, what is the value of GDP sold in 2010 if we were using 2005 prices? So we take the quantity in 2010, which happens to be 10, multiply it by the prices in 2005, and aggregate price level in 2005 was 100. So we've got 10 times 100 equals 1,000. Okay, so our real GDP in 2010 is 1,000. Our real GDP in 2005 was 1,000. Have we had any real economic growth over that period? No. Our nominal GDP has changed. Our nominal GDP in 2005 was 1,000. Our nominal GDP in 2010 is 1,180. Therefore, GDP has increased. The value of GDP has increased, but it's the value of nominal GDP which has increased. And why has the value of nominal GDP increased? Because prices have increased. You with me? In other words, this change is not due to a change in real economic activity. In other words, we haven't had any real economic growth. The only thing that's changed is the price level. And we know that by comparing real GDP in 2010 with real GDP in 2005. And real GDP in 2005 was 1,000. Real GDP in 2010 is 1,000. Now, the point that I was trying to make was, what if we do not know the price level in 2005? Okay? But we do know that prices have changed by 18% since 2005. Okay? Well, here we know what the relationship is between real GDP and nominal GDP. Real GDP is the nominal GDP multiplied by the change in prices, right? In other words, take nominal GDP and adjust it for the change in prices to get real GDP. So the change in prices is 18%. Therefore, if our nominal GDP is 1,180, adjusted by 18% downwards, right? So divided by 1 over 1.18, 18% downwards, and we get real GDP, 1,000 versus 1,180. Or, alternatively, we can say that our real GDP in 2010 times by the change in prices must equal our nominal GDP in 2010. In other words, if we know our real GDP, we've already calculated, we know it's 1,000, we take 1,000 multiplied by the change in prices. Sorry, that shouldn't actually be 1,000, that should be 10. Let me just adjust that quickly. I can't. Let me see if I can. Yeah. Okay, there we go. So our real GDP in 2010 should be 10 times the price level in 2000 times the change in price level. In other words, 1,000 times 1.18 gives us 1,180. So it's the same equation that we're dealing with here, just working backwards. So what are we essentially doing in this equation? In other words, our real GDP is the quantity in 2010 times the price level in 2010 times an adjustment for change in prices. And that's what our price indexes do. They adjust for the change in prices. Okay? An index accounting for changes in the prices. In other words, 1 over 1 plus change in price. Comes from knowing the prices in the two different years. If we didn't know the actual price level in 2005, but we knew what the change in prices were, we would know that the price index that we would know the price index that we'd need to adjust by. So the real GDP in 2010 would be the quantity in 2010 times the price level in 2010 times by an adjustment for changes in prices. In other words, we should get the same answer. Okay? How we calculate this price index is what we're going to talk about in this lecture today when we discuss inflation. But that is the relationship between real GDP and nominal GDP. Any number of different ways we could do the calculation. It's the intuition which is important, and hopefully it's the intuition which you now are comfortable with. Any questions? Sorry, let me leave that up there. Any questions on that? Okay. Returning then to chapter 22. As a quick recap as to where we were, we said that in chapter 22 we deal with two different concepts. We deal with unemployment, and we're also going to deal with inflation. We haven't got to inflation yet. We started talking about unemployment. Why is unemployment a problem? Well, it affects our well-being. How do we measure unemployment in South Africa? We use something called the Quarterly Labour Force Survey. I had a lot of questions about the Quarterly Labour Force Survey and how it works. Yesterday, they released the most recent quarterly labor force survey. So this was released yesterday. This is for the fourth quarter of 2016. If you have any technical questions about how the labor force survey works, well, as you can see, this document is 137 pages long. Guaranteed will answer any questions you have. Nevertheless, having read it, if there is still something you are uncertain about, do come and ask. We can chat about it. But just to give you an update, seeing as we're dealing with this material currently, how does our economy look at the moment, or how did it look at least in the fourth quarter of 2016, so up to the end of December 2016? The working age population, approximately 37 million. Our population at the moment is estimated at almost 57 million. 56 million. So it's 55.9 million. So almost 56 million is the total population. When we talk about working age population, we're talking about people in between the ages of 15 and 64, and we've got nearly 37 million of them. Of those 37 million, how many people are actually working formally? In other words, formally employed? Well, 16 million. Okay? So of a population of nearly 56 million people, we have 16 million working, which means 40 million who are dependent on those 16 million who are working. So when we say that unemployment is a problem in the South African economy, I think those numbers should give you some sort of indication of the scale of that. Okay? In other words, for every one person working, that person is supporting both themselves and nearly 4 other people on average. If that person is only earning, for example, 3,000 Rand a month, that means you've got nearly 5 people surviving on just under 3,000 Rand a month. So, next time you're in the club and you're dropping those Benjamins, yeah, think about that. Okay, so that has been released. It's available on the Stats SA website. Any of those figures that you want to know. Within the document are also discussions on how to calculate the unemployment rate, the absorption rate, and the participation rate. So this diagram here, sorry, it's just a repeat of this diagram here. It's just another way of looking at it. What is our current unemployment rate? So this graph is talking about 2012. It said in 2012 it was just below 25%. What is it currently? Our unemployment rate currently? Nearly 27%. Okay, so 26.5% is slightly better than 27.1%. So you'll probably hear on the news today, assuming you listen to the news, that the unemployment rate has gone down. So everyone's excited. Yeah, I'm not so sure that that's anything worth getting excited about. Since 2012, our unemployment has gone up a bit. Same with our absorption rate, same with our participation rate. All those figures are available. Our absorption rate is around 44%. Participation rate around 60%. Sorry, how do we calculate these things? Here are our equations. Those are equations you just need to learn. Yeah? Is there data for graduate unemployment? That is a good question, and I couldn't tell you exactly. There should be though, and let me give you an example of why we would expect to see something like that. If you look at this information, you can see How many people are employed in agriculture? How many are employed in mining, manufacturing, etc., etc.? So it is broken down to pretty narrow measures, right? Somewhere in here, in fact, let's try. Okay. Okay, here's education level, right? So, if you have less than matric, I think this is it says here percent. I think this is the unemployment. I'm guessing. I mean, oh no. I think this is percentage of population. Oh, here we go. Here's participation rate by education level. Okay. This is just percentage of labor force in terms of education, I think. Yeah, it's there. Anyway, I don't want to... I'll take a look at it, and then tomorrow when we start, I'll give you a breakdown of what those tables say. But yeah, that information is there. You're getting worried? You probably should be. And that's not... I don't mean that personally. Yeah, things are not looking good in the economy at the moment, and things are not looking good for the global economy in the next few years. So jobs are not necessarily going to be easy to come by. At least if you are a graduate, you have more of a chance of getting a job, but yeah, you're probably going to have to make your own job. Okay, we spoke about the different these different categories, what they potentially mean, what the idea of a discouraged worker is, different types of unemployment, and there's three main types: frictional, structural, cyclical. And this is the slide where we basically ended, where we were talking about the distinction between frictional, structural, and cyclical. We spoke in a fair amount of detail about what we mean by frictional. Frictional basically being people in between jobs. Structural, again, people in between jobs, but they're less employable than those people that are frictionally unemployed. Because if you are structurally unemployed, what that basically means is there's some drastic change you need to make in order to get re-employed. In other words, if you are structurally unemployed, maybe you need to change cities in order to get a job because there are no jobs for your skill set within your current city. Or structurally unemployed, maybe you need to change countries. Or structurally unemployed, your skill set is no longer good enough, you need to go back to school, you need to go and further your education. That's structurally unemployed. Frictionally unemployed, you've left one job, but there's a good chance you're going to start another job within the near future. There's no drastic changes that you need to make. Both frictional and structural unemployment happen all the time. And when we talk about full employment, we do not mean that there is no frictional and no structural unemployment. When we say full employment, we mean there are still frictionally unemployed people, there are still structurally unemployed people, but at full employment there are no cyclically unemployed people. So what are cyclically unemployed people? Cyclically unemployed people are people who have lost their job because the economy is not doing well. Okay? In other words, it's not about your skill level. It's about the fact that at this point in time, no one wants to employ you because the economy is not doing well enough. Okay? So this diagram that we saw previously, where we had actual real GDP doing this up and down thing, but potential real GDP just sort of increasing over time gradually. Well, any point along this potential line is a point of full employment. And as we move along the actual GDP line, our cyclical unemployment is either going up or going down. In other words, as this line crosses potential, cyclical unemployment is 0. As it goes below potential, cyclical unemployment goes up. As we go above potential, cyclical unemployment goes down a little bit. Okay? How would cyclical unemployment go down? Well, for example, remember, cyclical unemployment has to do with how well the economy is doing. If we're above full employment, it means the economy is doing better than what we would expect. People want to hire laborers, right? They're more eager to get workers on board, which means you're probably going to have less frictional unemployment, right? You're going to be in between jobs for a shorter space of time. Someone who would ordinarily be structurally unemployed, whereas that person would ordinarily at full employment have lost their job, maybe their employer decides, no, they're going to keep them on for a little bit longer because the economy is doing really well, right? So frictional and structural go down a little bit in a sense, right? And so our structural unemployment is then negative, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry, if a person decides to take a sabbatical, where would that fall between unemployment and employment? And if it's unemployment, where would it be?
So when you say a sabbatical, are you talking about in an academic space?
Well, a period of paid leave.
Okay, a period of paid leave. When we talk about employed people here, right? You have a job. Doesn't matter what you're doing at your job.
So if they're not working, so is that still employed?
Yeah, you're still employed. In other words, maybe you haven't experienced this, but I'm sure at some point you will. You work at a company and you're like, what is that guy actually adding to this organization, right? It doesn't matter, they are employed, right? Okay. Great. Okay, so that recaps what we were talking about. Any other questions? Okay. As I say, I'll just take a look at that document a bit more and then tell you tomorrow something about graduate unemployment. So, kicking off then today with more of a discussion on full employment. To reiterate, full employment does not mean no employment. Okay? Does not mean no employment. There will always be some unemployment. Why? Again, the distinction between cyclical unemployment and frictional versus structural. At full employment, we always have frictional and structural. If we have full employment, another way of saying we have full employment is to say we are at the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is frictional plus structural unemployment. Okay? If we are not at the natural rate of unemployment, then it means we have some form of cyclical unemployment. How is full employment related to GDP? And what I will do in a moment is draw a diagram of this on a separate document, just to reiterate all the points we've made. Full employment and GDP. The quantity of output produced when we are at the full employment level, so when we are at full employment, then we are producing what we refer to as potential GDP. Of course, actual real GDP may be above or below GDP, and hence unemployment may be above or below the natural rate. When we're measuring these things, of course, it's safe to say that authorities will never know whether we are actually at the natural rate or what the natural rate really is, right? Because it's a calculation based on estimates. So we spoke about that on Thursday, that this whole thing is always based on estimates. We described the statistics involved and the fact that you have a population and a sample. Yeah?
FE, do you mean frictional employment or
Sorry?
full employment?
Yeah, that means full. Okay? And bear in mind that the natural rate of unemployment is not necessarily constant either. So if we're trying to then understand how the government could or should respond to the unemployment rate or any unemployment figures, bear in mind that of course it's difficult to formulate appropriate responses if you don't actually know what the natural rate is. Are you above full employment? Are you below full employment? Depends what that rate actually is. So, just then to do that, to kind of emphasize exactly what it is that we're talking about. If we're plotting GDP against time, from chapter 1 we know that GDP kind of does this thing, and then it did that, and this was sort of 2008. Oops. Okay, so that is what we call the financial crisis, although really it's a financial crisis in Western economies, but we also experienced a little bit of this thing called the financial crisis. So what your textbook refers to this as real GDP, which is, I don't know, I don't like just referring to it as real GDP. I refer to it as actual real GDP, because then what we also draw is this thing which we call the trend line. So the trend line would look kind of like this, right? And this is trend, and the name for the trend is potential GDP in terms of your textbook. But just because it's called potential doesn't mean that it's not a measure of real GDP. So this is potential real GDP, and this is the actual real GDP. Both of them are measures of real GDP. If we take a point then like this point over here, at this point our actual real GDP, so I'm just going to call this actual real GDP, ARG, and this one is going to be potential real GDP. At a point like this, let's call it point A. At point A, actual real GDP is greater than potential real GDP. You happy with that? Anyone happy with that? Which means that if we're talking about actual real GDP tells us the unemployment rate. Okay? The unemployment rate is below the natural unemployment rate. Is everyone with me? Point A. Are you happy that if actual real GDP is above potential real GDP, then the unemployment rate is in fact below the natural unemployment rate? In other words, the number of people employed, right, is greater than the number of people that would be employed at, employment at full employment. Are you happy with that? Okay, give me some response, otherwise I just move on and I have absolutely no idea. You happy? No? Yeah? If we're at a point like point A, right, You happy that point A, our actual real GDP, the blue line, is above the red line, which measures potential GDP, right? If we're at point A, then the number of people that are employed is in fact greater than the number of people that would be employed at full employment. Because full employment happens there. That's the measure of full employment. At potential real GDP, we would have full employment. If our actual GDP is above potential GDP, then the number of people employed is above the number of people that would be employed at full employment. You happy with that? In other words, our employment measure is above the full employment level. If employment is above full employment, well then unemployment must be below the natural rate of unemployment. Because the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate at full employment. Everyone happy with that? What if we take a point like this point over here, call this point B. At point B, I would like you to tell me what's happening. Is the actual rate, is actual real GDP greater than, less than, or equal to potential real GDP? Less than. Is the unemployment rate greater than, less than, or equal to the natural rate of unemployment? I definitely heard different answers there. Greater than, everyone happy with that? The unemployment rate is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, what about the number of people employed at point B? Would it be greater than, less than, or equal to the number of people that would be employed if we were at full employment? It would be less than. Great. Okay, and then let's take one more point. Here we go. Okay, point C. At point C, is actual real GDP greater than, less than, or equal to potential real GDP? Equal to. Is the unemployment rate greater than, less than, or equal to the natural unemployment rate? And what about employment? The amount of people employed is greater than, equal to, or less than the number of people that would be employed at full employment? You happy that it's equal to? Because in fact at point C we are at full employment. Everyone happy with that concept? Any issues with this diagram, or can we move on? Happy? Okay. So just to clarify then, the natural rate of unemployment, it's natural, but we've still got unemployment. Why do we still have unemployment? Because there's frictional and structural unemployment. Okay? Even though it's the word natural, right? We still have unemployment. What influences the amount of frictional or structural unemployment? Well, there are a number of different factors that the textbook briefly talks about. For example, the age of the population. If you tend to have a young population, then you tend to have more people looking for work, which means you tend to have higher levels of either frictional or structural unemployment, which means your natural rate of unemployment will tend to be higher. Okay? What sort of structural change is happening? In other words, what's happening within the economy? Is there a lot of structural changes? To bring it back to the idea of how is this related to your real world experience, if we think about the numbers here, You got nearly 27% for the whole of 2016, and you've got around 25% at the end of 2015, and I can guarantee you that that number remains the same between 20, let's say, and between 20 and 30% since before you were born, right? If that's the case, what does that say about our natural rate of unemployment? If we always have high unemployment, right, are we saying that we are always then below potential GDP? Or are we saying that at our full employment level of GDP, we will always have high unemployment? What do you think? Okay, let me elicit some responses. What do you think? So, what?
You're below the potential.
So you would take it as being below potential. So if we have persistently high unemployment, you would interpret that as meaning we are persistently below our full employment level of GDP. We are always essentially doing worse than what we should be doing. Okay, gentleman with a hat. What do you think? Oh, two. Actually amazing. No, I'm going to go with that hat. You got a cap on. That doesn't count. Come on. Yeah? Yes.
I think it would be
You think we're below potential? Okay, gentleman with the cap. You also think it's below potential? Yeah?
What if your potential is already low?
Okay, well, let's look over
Is
here.
that possible?
Okay, remember, what is this red line potential? That's the trend over time, right? So if you've got a graph that looks like this, and I don't know, you can help me out on my maths, right? And it's going like this. Oh, sorry. Okay, so that's what your actual GDP is doing. Are you set? What everyone has told me so far is that the average of that line is that. Potential, right? Actual. So, our actual unemployment rate is consistently 27, sorry, not consistently 27, but consistently between 20 and, so our actual unemployment is consistently between 20 and 30%. Okay? Where is our natural rate of unemployment? At our, this is natural unemployment rate, or natural rate of unemployment. The only way our unemployment rate could be consistently below our potential is if our potential was sitting way above our actual for whatever reason, right? The only way our potential average could be above our actual is if in some imagined past we had actual up there somewhere, so that our potential was doing this, being brought down by some massively high average in the past. I can tell you that historically this has never happened. Which means that our natural rate of unemployment, given that our unemployment rate is consistently between 20 and 30%, means that our natural rate of unemployment must also be somewhere between 20 and 30%. In other words, we have a very high natural rate of unemployment. Why would we have a very high natural rate of unemployment? Well, let's think about some of the things that affect it that we've spoken about so far. Do we have a young population? We do. Have we had a lot of structural changes? We have. But more than that, we've also got, it's not on this slide, but Other things that affect your unemployment rate are wage rate, unemployment benefits, right? And what's not here is things like the skill level of the people within the economy relative to the skill level required within the economy. Just to give you an example of what that means, actually, let's look here. Where do most people get employed in our economy? Where's the highest number? Trade, okay. Trade just basically means people doing business, right? What's the second highest? Financial and business services. That's accountants, lawyers, whatever, economists. Yeah?
So the highest is community and social services.
Yeah, you're right. That is true. That is kind of like not really a thing. That just catches. Sorry, when I say it's not a thing, it is a thing, of course. What I mean is that's a broad scope of things. You can almost think of that as like the remainder. Everything that doesn't fit into what we've discussed so far, that's what goes into there. So yes, it is the biggest because it's also like contains the most different categories. Yeah. So what would be regarded as, say, low skills employment? Agriculture, mining, basic manufacturing, construction, right? Those are all on the low end of where people get employed, right? In other words, the structure of our economy is geared towards high value added stuff which requires education or high skill levels. This low skill level stuff, it's just not big enough. It doesn't generate enough of our GDP. So if we want to discuss issues like inequality in South Africa, what drives inequality? We have high disparity in wage levels. You have people that earn really, really high wages. So our Gini coefficient looks something like this. Okay, so you have a small number of people earning very high wages, and a large number of people over here earning very low wages. And most of this low wage stuff is over here or in self-employment. In other words, things like over here where you're just not really part of the formal economy, right? So what then drives inequality in the South African context? There is a political narrative which says access to land. In other words, if you own a piece of land, you become rich, is kind of the narrative that's spoken, is part of that narrative. Another part of that narrative is if you do not own a piece of land, you cannot, it's like you cannot really become anything. Whereas if you look at the statistical breakdown of where people get money from and how people get money, or how they get their wealth, more importantly, it has very little to do with actual land ownership. It is more access to resources. And even if you look at access to resources, it's got very little to do with ownership of resources. In other words, it makes very little difference who owns what on the JSE. Ownership of the JSE is primarily a question of savings. So if you've managed to earn money in the past and you put it away as savings, that is usually reflected in things like ownership of the JSE. But if you want to see what really drives inequality in terms of wealth levels, you look at who earns what income and you see that people that earn the highest income are the people that are in control of big companies. Companies that employ lots of people. In other words, CEOs, CFOs, right? CEOs and CFOs of high value added companies earn big salaries, right? If you are middle management in one of the top 4 banks, you are easily earning a couple of million a year. If you are top management in one of those big 4 banks, you are earning easily $1 million a month, right? Those top managers, what they earn and the wealth that they get has very little to do with ownership. They don't get paid R1 million a month because they have big share options. No, that's their salary, right? There's a political narrative driven in South Africa, which is to say that it's about ownership. When you look at what drives inequality, I'm suspicious. I don't feel like the figures indicate that inequality is driven that much by ownership. It's about access. Yes. Sorry? Those salaries. Let's say they are market related. They are still driving inequality. In other words, whether they are or are not market related does not change whether they are a driver of inequality or not. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand.
Cool.
My point is we should not complain if they are related because we are being paid of what we are doing.
Correct.
So, yes.
Yes, there is certainly that argument. That is one side of the argument. Anyone want to offer up a different side of the argument? In other words, the point put forward was, if income levels are what drives inequality, and income levels are determined by market forces, why are we complaining about income inequality, given that this is just a market solution? Yeah.
The problem is not that they're market related. It's
Okay.
that which market are you looking at? You can't compare a company in South Africa and expect to see over here which make the same money as someone in the UK or in the US.
Okay.
So it's the question of which market are you looking at?
Okay, so there's one counterpoint. We're saying it's market related. Those market related salaries are, however, market related to salaries that you could earn, for example, in the UK or in the US, right? Should those market level salaries be determining market level salaries within our economy? Here's a point. There were issues about CEO compensation in the US decades ago, right? CEO compensation was not publicly available. Okay? When it became mandated that it became publicly available, in other words, these things should be disclosed within financial statements, it was made public, it became public knowledge. At that point, right, from that point onwards, what happened was that CEO salaries escalated. Why? Because now CEOs had a comparative level. They knew what CEOs in other companies were asking. That changed what they were asking, right? So making the information public changed the dynamics of how those salaries were set, right? So if you're saying that it's simply market related, then we have to say, right, what do we know about the market structure? What is the access to information? Is this a free market? Is this monopoly driven? Right? What is the structure of our market? And, sorry, I'll get to your point in a moment. And certainly what we have discussed, or what you would have discussed in microeconomics, is that not all market structures are necessarily desirable from a social point of view. In other words, why do we have anti-monopoly laws, right? Because we feel that there are problems when we have monopoly. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yes.
Okay, if you say inequality is driven by access, the lack of access to resources and of ownership. Then why
Yes.
is there such a heavy narrative on being an entrepreneur and running businesses?
That is a good question, because entrepreneurs in general do not earn good salaries. In fact, entrepreneurial remuneration tends to be on the lower end of the remuneration scale. Some entrepreneurs, however, make it really big. And those that make it really big skew that scale, right? They up the average, if you get what I'm saying, right? The primary narrative for that entrepreneur-driven whatever discourse is the fact that we need to employ more people. And the way that you employ more people is by having more opportunities for employment, which are created by people who start businesses, who are ultimately entrepreneurs. So to up employment levels, you need to up the amount of business happening, right? In the South African economy, in fact, it's probably a problematic narrative, because what you will see is that most of the wealth that is created, most of the wealth, in other words, if we're talking about the inequality levels, where the income comes from, what sorts of companies generate high return, or high returns generally, right? In other words, lots of wealth. They tend to be large companies, right? Really, really large companies, who have what's called increasing returns to scale. In other words, your costs go down per unit as you get bigger. In the South African economy, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the bigger you are, the better you are going to be doing in the economy. And in fact, if you're quite small, it's difficult to compete. So I don't know if that narrative is really the best narrative to be driving, but it is a narrative. And certainly, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you need a lot of skills. And there's another thing that matters a lot for entrepreneurship. If you look at places where entrepreneurship is really successful, it tends to be in countries where the social security fallback, right, is substantial. In other words, you try something, you fail, you fall back onto social security, you're okay, right? You invest your life savings into this venture, it fails, you go onto the dole, right? And you try again. We do not have that kind of social security. We do not have the ability for people to just invest their savings, lose it, and then bounce back because they've got social support.